The next 2 hours, we will be dealing with chapter 3, that is Paul's conversion, or I call it as Damascus experience. Yesterday, I have pointed you out the two sources for studying Paul. So, to study about Paul's conversion or Damascus experience, also we have two sources that speak of his conversion. First one, his own letters. So we consider his letters as primary sources. So we have the primary sources that speak about Paul's conversion. Please note down the references. Galatians 1, 11 to 24, 1 Corinthians 9, 1, 15, 8 and verse 10. Then 2 Corinthians 4, 4 to 6. Then Philippians chapter 3 from verse 7 to 8 and verse 12. These are the references where Paul himself speaks about his own conversion, his own Damascus experience. Then we have the secondary sources, very vivid and interesting narratives coming from the Acts of the Apostles, which we consider it as a secondary source. Please note down the references. Acts of the Apostles, chapter 9, verses 1 to 19, chapter 22, verses 1 to 21, then chapter 26, verses from 1 to 32, the entire chapter. So in the Acts of the Apostles, we find in three places where Luke narrates about the Damascus experience of Paul. So as I said, in the Acts of the Apostles, unlike Paul's own letters, we find very vivid and very interesting narratives as it is presented, like a movie. As we read, we feel that is really happening in front of the eyes. So very vivid, clear, very interesting narratives we feel to read again and again. Now, the narration that we find in chapter 9 is Luke's own narrative. So Luke himself is narrating the Damascus experience of Paul. Then the narration that we find in chapter 22 and 26, the event is described in the context of Paul's speeches. Of course, it is Luke who was writing, but Luke puts into the mouth of Paul. So Luke presents this event as if Paul himself was narrating. So Luke puts into the context of Paul's speeches, that Paul himself narrating his experience of conversion. The event that we find in chapter 22, I want to say the context, in which context the speech of Paul took place. It was before a hostile Jewish crowd at the temple in Jerusalem. There was a lot of opposition for Paul from his own people. So it was like apologetic. He was defending himself. So in this context, Paul was speaking to his own people in the temple of Jerusalem. So before the hostile Jewish people. So that is the context in which Paul narrates his own conversion experience. That's what we find in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 22. Then the narration that we find in chapter 26 was in the context of that happened before the Roman governor Festus and the royal duo Agrippa and Bernice, again defending himself by narrating his story. So second context was before the Roman governor Festus and the royal duo Agrippa and Bernice. Now there was a hot debate regarding the historical value of these events that we find in Acts of the Apostles. So it was a hotly debated issue. But whatever may be, we admit that the event of Paul's conversion took place in his lifetime. Then we also acknowledge or admit that the historical data that Luke applies was for his own particular theology. See, at the end, every book of the Bible brings out a theology. Bible is not a historical book. So it brings out some kind of theology So Luke might have applied this vivid and his own way of applying it to bring out his own particular theology. So in that sense, we cannot deny the historical value. Then when did it happen? Different authors give different dates. For example, scholar Born Calm puts the date around 32 AD. Then scholar Dahl puts in early 30s. He says in early 30s. He doesn't give a precise year, but he puts it as early 30s. Then Fitzmyer, he relates this particular event to the death of Stephen, the first martyr, and puts the date as 36 AD. So now we have 32 AD, early 30s, and 36 AD. So we have three opinions. There are more opinions from different scholars, but we assume that this particular event had taken place around 33 AD. Now I would like to explain to you the proper event, the Damascus experience of Paul. I found the explanation of one scholar, he has put it very beautifully, is J. Munk. Regarding this Damascus experience, he has put very beautifully into one sentence. Then that one sentence I have divided into 4 parts, and then each part will be explained. Maybe you can note down the sentence. Paul was totally unprepared for the experience of a direct and sudden intervention of the risen Jesus, through which the former persecutor turned to Christ and received his apostolic call and commission. Now this one sentence I have divided into 4 parts. First one, totally unprepared for his experience. See, while Paul was his way to Damascus, he might not have imagined such an event would take place. Scholar Dahl said, I quote him, when Paul set out for Damascus, he was not tortured by a troubled conscience as the young monk Martin Luther. So this scholar Dahl is comparing the position of Paul with Martin Luther. So unlike Martin Luther, Paul never had any struggle, any inner struggle. He was fully convinced of his religion, Judaism. So he 100% he decided to go to Damascus and kill or bring Christians to the court in Jerusalem. So there was no troubled conscience. He was clear of his mission, of which he was traveling to Damascus. So that is why J. Munk beautifully said, it was totally unprepared for this experience. Then we can also say it was not the conversion of a penitent sinner. Paul, his conscience was clear. He never felt that he was a sinner or killing Christians or destroying Christianity was something sinful. No. So it was not the conversion of a penitent sinner. Then another point in that, he was fully convinced of his action in favor of the law. That's what I said. He was completely convinced of his religion for Judaism. So that's what this point means. He was fully convinced of his action in favor of the law. Maybe put the reference in bracket. Galatians 1:13-14. We find this idea there when Paul explains about his experience. Then the salvation that would come to him from his zeal. So he was fully convinced of his action in favor of the law and the salvation that would come to him from his zeal. Strict observance of the law was salvation for the Jews and especially for Pharisees. So he was fully convinced of his mission to Damascus, totally unprepared for this experience. That's what we mean. Totally unprepared for this experience. Then second one, a direct and sudden intervention of the risen Jesus. So it happened through a sudden and a direct intervention of the risen Lord. He was joyfully going, vigorously going, and then suddenly it happens. The event took place all of a sudden. That's what we mean. So in that sudden intervention of the risen Jesus, we can point out 1 or 2 important points. This Damascus event was a sovereign act of God. Whatever the event that took place, we say that there was a great light and then Paul fell down from his horse. He was blind, he could not see anything, only he could hear the voice of Jesus and so on. So whatever may be, whatever happened was an act of sovereign God. By this act, God overtook Paul even against his own will. He never willed to follow Christ, to know Christ, to become a Christian. So God took over Paul even against his own will. Thus, this man who was persecutor of Christ and the church had this startling and unforeseen experience because of this sudden and direct intervention of the risen Jesus. So, direct why? Because Jesus himself intervened, not through any human agent. I quote another scholar to conclude that second point, J.C. Becker. He says, the most striking thing about Paul's conversion is its suddenness and unpreparedness. Then we come to the third aspect of the comment of J. Munk. The former persecutor turned to Christ. So, as a result of this sudden and direct intervention of the risen Jesus, so the former persecutor turned to Christ. Conversion proper. Or we can also put this way, with sovereign authority, the exalted Lord made the persecutor into his witness, into a disciple. So thereafter, Paul becomes a disciple, a follower of Christ. No more the follower of the law, the Torah, the Jewish tradition. So now he becomes a witness to Jesus Christ, a witness to his gospel. He becomes a disciple. Under that point, few comments. It was an encounter that changed Saul, the persecutor, into Paul, the apostle. So Saul becomes Paul. Saul, the persecutor, becomes now Paul, the apostle. So thus, the church's adversary, the church's enemy is brought into Christian camp. Then I would like to present few aspects of the event that took place. So one of the elements of this experience of Paul on the road to Damascus is the light from heaven. What does it mean, light from heaven? First of all, it is a supernatural phenomenon which indicates divinity. Okay, that flash of light, as Luke narrates. First of all, it is a supernatural phenomenon that indicates divinity. The same glory shines on the face of Christ. We find it in 2 Corinthians 4:6. The same glory shines on the face of Christ. Otherwise, it is the light of Christ. No? Christ is divine. So it was a divine light, which later Paul mentions in his letter in 2 Corinthians 4:6, that glory, that light shines on the face of Christ. So as a result of this divine light, Paul falls down to the ground. Then he becomes blind to experience the vision of Christ as the Lord of glory. That idea we find in 1 Corinthians 2:8. So he becomes blind to experience the vision of Christ as the Lord of glory. So now the divine light took over Paul's human sight. That's what symbolically it means. That is why in Philippians 3:12, narrating this Damascus experience, Paul attributes this purely to God's grace, nothing of his own, no merit of himself. It was purely God's grace. So he says there, Christ Jesus made me his own. I would like to conclude that third point, quoting another scholar, H.G. Wood. I read, he was not converted to a system of Christian thought or to completely organized tradition. He was converted to Christ rather than to Christianity. So to have an overall understanding of his conversion, this quote from H.G. Wood gives a lot of reflection. This can enlighten us. He was not converted to a system of Christian thought, but or completely to an organized tradition or an institutionalized religion, but he was converted to the person of Christ rather than to Christianity. Now we move to the fourth point, element of J. Munk statement. Received his apostolic call and commission. So he was called to be sent out to become an apostle to the Gentiles. In other words, the risen Lord entrusted him with a mission. What is that mission? To be an apostle to the Gentiles. Some reflections under that. Now, after this Damascus experience, the Lord speaks to Ananias to go to meet Paul, because now Paul is a chosen instrument to carry the name of Jesus before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. Note down the references. Acts of the Apostles, chapter 9, 15 to 16, 13, 47, 18, 6, 22, 21, and chapter 26, verse 17 and verse 23. I quote 2 or 3 references where Paul speaks about his mission that is entrusted to him by Jesus. Acts of the Apostles, chapter 13, verses 47. I have set you to be a light for the Gentiles, so that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. So the Lord speaks to Paul. I have set you to be a light for the Gentiles, so that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. So the mission of Paul is very much stressed. That is, he had to become an apostle to the Gentiles. Several times this we find in his letters and Acts of the Apostles. Then Galatians chapter 1, 15 to 16, where Paul says that he is given a revelation of Christ that he might preach to the Gentiles. So Paul says that he is given a revelation of Christ that he might preach Christ among the Gentiles. Then finally, Paul says, God revealed his Son to me so that I might proclaim among the Gentiles. Claims several times about his mission. So he's very much convinced of his mission. So he says, God revealed his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. References: Romans 1:13, 11:13, 15:16, then Galatians chapter 2 verses from 1 to 10, Ephesians chapter 3 verses 1 and 8, 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 7, then finally 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 11, where this idea of Paul's mission comes. Just listen. I would like to summarize whatever is said so far from 2 perspectives. One is from Luke's own narrative and the other from Paul's own letters. From Luke's own narration, actually Luke is silent on Paul's call to be an apostle equal with the 12, because Paul always claims that he is an apostle. As I said in the first session, there are only 12 apostles, but Paul always equaled himself. But Luke, he never mentions Paul as an apostle equal to the other 12. Now from Damascus, according to Acts of the Apostles, from Damascus, Paul is brought back to Jerusalem. Only then in the temple and by means of a fresh vision, he is given his vocation. Acts of the Apostles, chapter 22, 17 to 21. Thus, Acts of the Apostles makes his missionary work in the Gentile world originating in Jerusalem. After that fresh vision, after his vocation call, then Paul carried out his great work, mission work, not just as an apostle, but also as an authorized representative of the apostolic church. That is how he equals himself to be one of the 12 apostles. Then from his own letters, Paul seldom spoke about his conversion and called to be an apostle. But even though he speaks seldom about his conversion, Damascus experience, but whenever he speaks, he does not mince his words. He speaks very powerfully, forcefully. For example, Philippians 3:7. He says, "Whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ." So, thus, in small sentences but very powerfully, he narrates about his personal encounter with the risen Lord. Bonham says, he says, it is perhaps the most decisive statement about his life. Commenting on Philippians 3:7, Bonham says, it is perhaps the most decisive statement about his life. I read one or two sentences to conclude that. The truth of his gospel for the Gentiles and the divine origin of his commission are quite inseparable. Okay, the gospel for the Gentiles and his divine origin of his commission are quite inseparable. Again, I quote Bonham. He says, they form the two sides of the one coin, bearing the impression of the authority of the one divine call. So there is divine call. At the same time, there is mission to the Gentiles. He received his vocation. At the same time, his vocation to become an apostle to the Gentiles. That's what he means. So by this, Paul is contesting and demolishing. This is very important. So by this vocation to be an apostle to the Gentiles, what is happening? Paul is contesting and demolishing the connection between the gospel and the Jewish tradition. So till this experience, Paul was after Jewish tradition, Torah, law, observance of the law. Now he is breaking with that Jewish tradition. 1 Corinthians 15:8 refers to himself being constituted an apostle through the appearance that the Lord risen granted him. So again, 1 Corinthians 15:8 is a direct reference where Paul claims himself to be an apostle. So this morning we began with chapter 2, that is Paul's conversion or Damascus experience. In that we have seen the first point, two sources that speak of Paul's conversion, and in that we have analyzed the Paul's experience of conversion basing on the comment given by J. Munk. As a second point in chapter 2, let us analyze the call of Paul. The call of Paul we can compare to the call of the people in the Old Testament. Especially, I would like to compare with the call of Jacob and the call of Moses. Damascus experience, first of all, is a unique vocation, unique invitation, a special call and a direct call. The Lord himself calls Paul. So, this call of Paul evokes the inaugural call of the prophets like Jeremiah and the servant of God in Isaiah 49, then Jacob and Moses. So we can compare the call of Paul to these people, Jeremiah, servant of Yahweh, Jacob and Moses. Now Paul says that God's grace was there right from the beginning of his life, even before he was formed in the womb of his mother. Galatians 1:15-16, where Paul says, God set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. I did not confer with any human being. Galatians chapter 1 verses 15-16. Jeremiah 1:5. You remember the call of Jeremiah? Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you, I appointed you a prophet to the nations. So very similar. We can very well compare vocation of Paul to the call of Jeremiah. There are four aspects in every call. First, let us see in Saul's commission, Saul's call, that we find in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 9, verses 4-6. First one, call by name, Saul, Saul, isn't it? Did Jesus call him by name? Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? 9:4. Second one, response or question. So when a person is called by name, there will be a response or question. In the case of Paul, was there a response or a question? Question. What was the question? Who are you, Lord? 9:5. There is a revelation. What is the revelation given to Paul? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. 9:5. Then fourthly, there is a commission. What is the commission given to Paul? Enter the city. You will be told what you are to do. 9:6. In case of the call of Jacob, we find Genesis 46 verses 2 and 3. God spoke to Israel. Israel means Jacob, no? Another name for Jacob is Israel. In visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Then he said, here I am. In case of Jacob, there is a response. There is no question, there is response. Then God said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. That is a commission. What is the commission? Go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. So, first, call by name, Jacob, Jacob. Second, response or question. Here in case of Jacob, there is response, here I am. Third, revelation, revelation from God. I am God, the God of your fathers. Then fourthly, there is a commission, go down to Egypt. Then in case of call of Moses, also we find the same structure. First, call by name, Moses, Moses. There was a response, that of Jacob, here I am. Then what was the revelation? I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then what was the commission? Go to Pharaoh. The call of Paul is very much similar to these Old Testament personalities. Jeremiah, servant of Yahweh in Isaiah 49, also more or less same. And then Jacob in Genesis, then call of Moses in Exodus. The call of Paul was a prophetic experience, a prophetic call, and a commission to go forth and preach the gospel. So, as we have seen so far, Paul was called in the prophetic style of the Old Testament prophets. To make Israelite generations flourish, Jacob was called. And to liberate the people of Israel, Moses was chosen. Similarly, Paul was given the commission to liberate the Gentiles. So that is why the main commission, vocation, call of Paul is to become an apostle to the Gentiles. Actually, in the life of Israelites, the call of Moses was the turning point in their life, because Moses was chosen, called to liberate the people of Israel from Egypt, from the clutches of Pharaoh. So also in the New Testament or in the new church, the call of Paul is the turning point. God's salvation is not only for the Jews but for the Gentiles also. So really it is a turning point in the church, as it was a turning point, the liberation of Israelites from Egypt. This God's direct intervention on the way to Damascus was not just an instant, not just an event that took place, but it took place at conception itself. That is why Paul says, before I was born, had that revelation later, convinced of this later. That is why he writes. Then I would like to finish that God's call, quoting from 1 Corinthians 15:8, where Paul says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. No? Jesus appeared after his resurrection. Jesus appeared to apostles and many others. So last of all, the risen Lord also appeared to me, Paul, an untimely born. He says in 1 Corinthians 15:8. So all this stresses that his call, his vocation. Then in 1 Corinthians 15:9, verse 9, we find, for, he continues that, for I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. He speaks of his vocation, his call. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 8 and verse 9. Then in Galatians chapter 2:9, he equals himself to St. Peter. Like St. Peter, I am also an apostle, called by Jesus, the risen Lord, directly, not by any human intervention. So Galatians 2:9, Paul equals his apostleship to that of Peter. In 2 Corinthians 12:11, Paul claims that his apostleship is more than others. 2 Corinthians 12:11. There you find that Paul claiming himself an apostle even more than others. To conclude this, St. Jerome calls Paul as the 13th apostle. To conclude chapter, I would like to present to you the summary of the conversion of Paul. Now, after having listened, studied about the conversion of Paul, his Damascus experience, his personal encounter with the risen Lord, so we all of us agree that this event happened in his life. There is no doubt about it. The Damascus event is an experience he could never forget in all his life, because oftentimes we find in his letter, either through short phrases or directly writing about his Damascus experience. So Paul never forgot. He always mentions about this experience. It was an experience in which he encountered the risen Lord. 1 Corinthians 9:1. This risen Lord who made him slave. Galatians 1:10. He says, I am the slave of Christ. Christ made me his slave. As such, there exists a perfect harmony between Paul and the gospel of Jesus. He made him believe and proclaim Jesus as Lord. Even his theology bears the distinct stamp of the above encounter. So the whole theology of Paul emerges from this Damascus experience. Then Cardinal Martini said that this was a transfiguration experience of Paul. The Damascus experience is a transfiguration experience of Paul. Then we know that Paul was a persecutor of Christians. He witnessed and in a way supported the martyrdom of Stephen. The persecutor and enemy of the Christians became the most enthusiastic proponent of Christianity by an encounter of Jesus on the way to Damascus. The experience on the way to Damascus was a turning point in Saul's life, as well as in the history of Christianity. Saul becomes Paul and realizes that the crucified Christ is the Messiah for whom the Jews were waiting for. Jews were waiting for a Messiah, but a political Messiah. Also Paul, like any Jew, Paul also was waiting. But now he realizes, after this Damascus experience, he realizes that crucified Christ is the Messiah for whom the whole Jewish nation is waiting for. After the Damascus experience, Jesus becomes the center of Paul's life and activity. Till then, what was the center of his life and activity? Law, the Torah, observance of the law, meticulous, scrupulous observance of the law. Now he underwent a real conversion. Paul gained new insights about the cross. Paul realized and believed that salvation is extended to the Gentiles also. Jewish religion is sectarian because it believes that only Jews are called to salvation. Hence, they disregarded the Gentiles. They underestimated the Gentiles. But God accepts Gentiles also. So after the conversion, Paul acknowledged this factor and called himself the apostle to the Gentiles. Before I conclude chapter, I would like to give also some light, some points on what happened. Where was Paul after his conversion? Now in Galatians 1:17, Paul says that he went away to Arabia. At the end, he returned to Damascus, the Syrian capital. Paul was on his way to Damascus to persecute Christians. On his way, he got converted, and then he had to return to Jerusalem with the help of Ananias and others. So he regained his health, his energy, and then he moved to Arabia. So Galatians 1:17, Paul himself says. Now at that time, Arabia was the part of Nabatean kingdom ruled by Aretas IV, 9 BC to 40 AD. 2 Corinthians 11:32. But at the same time, remember, Luke never mentions about Paul's visit to Arabia. Only from his own letter we find. Okay, Luke in the Acts of the Apostles never mentions after the conversion Paul went to Arabia and so on. So we don't find anything of that sort, that visit, in Acts of the Apostles. What Luke says is Paul spent several days in Damascus after his conversion. Acts 9:19. That's what Luke says. He never mentions about his visit to Arabia, but what he says is Paul spent several days in Damascus itself after his conversion. Of course, first he went to Jerusalem. After regaining himself, he came to Damascus and he spent several days. Then from Damascus he went to Arabia. That is said by Paul, Galatians 1:17. Luke doesn't say that. What we can presume is it's something similar to that of Jesus going to the desert before his public ministry, 40 days and nights, where Jesus was praying, preparing himself. Perhaps Paul wanted that sort of experience to prepare himself. Now he received his vocation, called to be an apostle of Gentiles. It's not easy. Perhaps we can presume that Paul prepared himself. One possible answer why he went to Arabia is, I quote, to reflect on the new situation. So what is the new situation? Now he's no more a Jew but a follower of Christ. He's not merely a follower or disciple of Christ, but his whole idea of his Jewish religion has changed. So it's a new context, a new situation. So he went to Arabia probably to reflect on the new situation, perhaps to commune with God in the vicinity of Horeb, the Mount of God, which is known as Mount of God, where Moses and Elijah had communed with him in the past. See Exodus 31, where Moses was on Mount Horeb, the Mount of God, to have a dialogue with Yahweh. And Elijah we find in 1 Kings 19:8, where he communed with God on Mount Horeb. So perhaps he also wanted the experience of that of Moses and Elijah. So this is said by scholar Bruce in his book Paul. So now we can conclude, we can point out 2 points, 2 elements about Paul's Arabian mission. First one, Paul preached in Arabia, but it was not a success, and hence he returned to Damascus. Second opinion, as we have already said in the words of Bruce, Paul went to Arabia to reflect, to meditate, and to get strengthened in his vocation to the apostle to the Gentiles. So these are only presumptions of these biblical scholars, because nobody knew exactly. Paul also doesn't narrate anything, but at least he clearly mentioned that he went to Arabia. So second possibility is very much can be considered. Perhaps he went to Arabia to spend some time in silence, to reflect, meditate, to get strengthened before he comes to the public, to the Gentile world, to introduce the gospel of Christ. So that possibility is very much on the cards.